Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us again for the second day of March meeting, which convenes this year under the banner of the Postcolonial Constellation, Art, Culture, Politics after 1960, and coincides with the 30 years of Sharjah Biennial 15. Thank you for joining us here today. It's a great pleasure to be able to welcome our guest speakers, many of whom have flown from far corners of the globe, and some who join us through pre-recorded presentations and via Zoom. I would like to start with a little housekeeping, as usual. Please know that all sessions are in English and simultaneous translation is available in Arabic. You can collect your translation headsets outside at the registration desk. Tea, coffee, and lunch will be provided throughout the day. We also have a reading room and book display in the room outside the hall for the duration of the conference. Our first session today is a keynote titled Building the Postcolonial Imaginary, the Early History of the Institute of International Visual Arts, Iniva, 1994 to 2004 by Tawadros, Director, Whitechapel Art Gallery, who unfortunately could not be with us in person, but has pre-recorded her keynote, and she will be joining us via Zoom after the presentation.
I'm honored to be with you here today, albeit virtually, to address this year's March meeting. I'd like to extend my heartfelt thanks to Hur Al-Kasimi and Salah Hassan for their generous invitation and for the very important and pioneering work that they continue to do in Sharjah. I'm only sorry that I can't be there with you in person. My talk today focuses on the work for just over a decade as founding director of the Institute of International Visual Arts, Iniva, in London, and the interventions made by Iniva over a decade in the arena of contemporary art and culture. When Iniva was established in London in 1994, the art world looked a very different place, and the international agenda in Europe was reflected in and dominated by two major visual arts festivals, Documenta in Kassel, the international exhibition established after the Second World War as part of Germany's post-war cultural reconstruction, and which takes place every 5 years on the easternmost edge of West Germany, and the Venice Biennale, established in the 19th century as a cultural showcase for established nations. The focus of most art institutions in the post-war years was on a traditional Western European and North American canon, which was narrowly cast with little reference to artistic practice by artists perceived to be outside that canon. Since then, we've seen some significant changes in the art world. We've witnessed the rapid absorption of contemporary art into the global economy, becoming a multi-million-pound industry. As with other areas of the economy, there's been a gradual erosion of existing barriers to the consumption, distribution, and exchange of contemporary artworks across national borders, evidenced by the proliferation of art biennials in every corner of the world, from Berlin to Dakar, from Istanbul to Sharjah, from Dakar to Shanghai, from Havana to Sao Paulo. There are now over 200 biennales of contemporary art taking place across the world, not to mention the explosion of art magazines, websites, and discussion forums reporting on the state of contemporary art worldwide. Iniva was launched at the conference at Tate Britain in April 1994 as a new organisation on the British art scene, propelled into existence by the efforts of a group of culturally diverse British artists, curators and critics. Wholly funded from public funds by the Arts Council of Great Britain, Iniva's brief was to promote the work of visual artists from diverse cultural backgrounds from the UK and abroad. Originally named the Institute of New International Visual Arts, the conference had been convened to address the question of how a new internationalism could be articulated, and specifically to explore how this newly established organisation could define a new paradigm for the visual arts under the rubric of a new internationalism, which would expand the narrow focus of the contemporary art discourse at that time. Conference participants, myself included, had no easy answers, but we tussled with the agenda proposed by the conference organisers and the proposition for this new organisation to set parameters for what constituted the international beyond the borders of Europe and North America, and to establish a global vision which would encompass the ideas, practices, and experience not only of artists and thinkers from Africa, Asia, South America, and the Middle East, but also those of the populations of Europe and North America, whose origin and cultural backgrounds lay beyond its geographical limits. The conference assembled an astonishingly diverse group of speakers, including the artists Rashida Rayin, Gordon Bennett, Jimmy Durham, Gavin Yantiers, Evelyn Nicodemus, Olu Gube and Fred Wilson, curators Ho Hanru, Raji Kuroda, Gerardo Mosquera, Guillermo Santamaria, and Elizabeth Sussman, and art historians Hal Foster, Geeta Kapoor, Sarat Maharaj, Judith Wilson, and myself. Concluding my presentation to the conference, this is what I said. We have in recent years become accustomed to using a kind of critical shorthand, which has led us to talk about the margins and the periphery as a position diametrically opposed to the center. We talk about blackness in antithesis to whiteness. We do this at the same time as we reject the dichotomies and binaries which inform Western culture. In the process, we risk falling headlong into what is perhaps the greatest pitfall of all, that of constructing from the politics of difference yet another unassailable fortress which will be absorbed into the canon of Western art and art history. If we really mean to refute fixed positions and absolute categories in our thinking, if we're really serious about giving up the search for a complete, all-embracing answer, then we have to take on board the dynamic of change, as distinct from progress or evolution, as an intrinsic part of our critical armor, accepting that what we say at this particular moment in time, from this particular place, is provisional, not fixed, unalterable, or exclusive, and most importantly, that it is the work of art itself and its aesthetic, cultural, and epistemological frame which should mold our critical language. 20 years later, this remains a concise articulation of the artistic and intellectual project with which I have been engaged throughout the intervening years, in my work at Iniva, through my writings, and in my curatorial practice. Over the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to map out some of the key areas of Iniva's artistic activities and some of my artistic and intellectual preoccupations, refracted through Iniva's programs. But first of all, I want to talk a little about the context out of which Iniva emerged. Iniva emerged in the mid-1990s out of a specific urban and cultural context. Post-colonial Britain, and London in particular, had seen a continuous influx of migrants from the former British Empire in the post-war years. There was, and continues to be, a large concentration of artists in the city, which has acted as a magnet for artists arriving in Britain from elsewhere. In the immediate post-war years, there were consecutive waves of artists from Commonwealth countries coming to London to work as artists, mainly from Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, including artists such as Aubrey Williams and Frank Bowling, and artists like David Madalla, who established the gallery and magazine Signals in the mid-1960s, and Rashida Rayin, who established a number of publications, most famously Third Text, which he set up in the early 1980s. One of the first projects that Iniva produced was a solo exhibition of David Madalla's work, The Secret History of the Mondrian Fan Club, Mondrian in London, timed to coincide with a Carla Press monograph by Guy Brett. Carla Press was another venture of the artist Rashida Rayin. The exhibition comprised both new works as well as a restaging of earlier works by Madalla. At the same time, Iniva also published a facsimile edition of Signals magazine. In the 1980s, Britain saw the emergence of a new generation of artists, writers, and intellectuals, born and brought up in the UK, but who came from different cultural backgrounds, and who developed new ideas and practices which would have profound effects upon British culture as a whole. In 1980s Britain, the idea of a settled, homogeneous mainstream identity was being challenged by a number of wholly different artists, musicians, writers, and filmmakers. From Derek Jarman's dystopian vision of the future in Jubilee, through to Stephen Frear's more celebratory depiction of multiracial, multisexual Britain in My Beautiful Laundrette, the decade from the late 1970s to the late 1980s marked a radical shift in the social and cultural urban fabric of Britain, for which London was the central stage. London was forging a new identity, which is to become synonymous with the multiple identities of its inhabitants and their interrelationships, articulating a spectrum of new social, cultural, and artistic connections which crisscrossed the city and transgressed racial boundaries. London's creative heterogeneity and cultural miscegenation found form, not only in the novels of Hanif Qureshi and the songs of the Clash, but also in the works of a new generation of artists, writers, and filmmakers. By the mid-1980s, the Institute of International Contemporary Arts London had become a significant meeting place for Black artists, writers, and thinkers who had heralded a significant shift in wider British culture and society. This new generation of artists, filmmakers, writers, and musicians was contesting the settled image of Britain as a monocultural society, and the capital was frequently the focal point for cultural and political struggles to redefine Britishness and British culture. Probably the most important theoretician and critical thinker of this cultural conjuncture was the sociologist Stuart Hall, who was at the vanguard of establishing the new discipline of cultural studies. Stuart Hall's paper at the ITCA's conference, The Real Me, would become a kind of manifesto for artists and intellectuals like myself, who were looking to articulate a different set of critical positions and ways of seeing. I want to read you an extract from Stuart Hall's paper at that conference. Thinking about my own sense of identity, he said, I realised that it has always depended on the fact of being a migrant, on the difference from the rest of you. So one of the fascinating things about this discussion is to find myself centred at last. Now that in the postmodern age, you all feel so dispersed, I become centred. What I've thought of as dispersed and fragmented comes paradoxically to be the representative modern experience. He went on, I believe it's an immensely important game when one recognises that all identity is constructed across difference and begins to live with the politics of difference. Ethnicity can be a constitutive element in the most viciously regressive kind of nationalism or national identity. But in our times, as an imaginary community, it's also beginning to carry some other meanings and to define a new space of identity. It insists on difference, on the fact that every identity is placed, positioned in a culture, a language, a history. Every statement comes from somewhere, from somebody in particular. It insists on specificity, on conjuncture, but it's not necessarily tied to fixed, permanent, unalterable positions. It's not wholly defined by exclusion. I took up my new post as Iniva's first director 2 days before the conference at the Tate Gallery. Not long after that, I convinced Stuart Hall to act as a temporary chair of Iniva. We worked together for over 11 years as director and chair of Iniva in what was one of the most creative and productive partnerships of my career. Initially, Iniva had been conceived as a building-based organisation, modelled on the Whitechapel Art Gallery in London, or as a traditional Kunsthalle gallery space. In the early 1990s, there was no shortage of gallery spaces in London. Space itself was not the issue, but rather what happened in those spaces. The challenge as I saw it, was not only to do things differently in terms of the content of Iniva's artistic programmes, but also to develop a new and innovative organisational model and way of working. Ordinarily, the exhibition programme was, and still remains, the main focus of activity of a visual arts organisation, and everything else follows on from that. At Iniva, we developed 5 discrete areas of artistic programming and production: education projects, exhibitions, multimedia, publications, and research. We evolved a fluid and dynamic way of working through which one project could lead into another. For example, Keith Piper's solo exhibition at the Royal College of Art, which was developed alongside a monograph, a computer game, and a club mix presentation, which mixed Keith Piper's images with music in a club context. The important point here is that we were rejecting the boundaries of the physical gallery space and were seeking to dissolve the walls of the white cube to intervene in everyday spaces. In this sense, diaspora was understood not simply as an experience or a cultural position, but as a way of working for the organisation, which could occupy multiple, diverse physical sites at one and the same time, making artistic and intellectual interventions in different physical forms, aimed at different audiences. 10 years after it was established, Iniva, in partnership with Autograph, the Association of Black Photographers, decided to locate itself permanently in a new purpose-built building in Rivington Place in the East End of London, commissioned by the two organisations and designed by the architect David Adjaye. By that point, Iniva had become firmly established as an arts institution which anticipated new trends and new ways of working in the contemporary visual arts. But in the early years, we rejected the idea of being located permanently and instead worked peripatetically across a number of formats and spaces simultaneously. Unsurprisingly, ideas of location, site, and space were central to Iniva's artistic and intellectual programming, as well as our physical relationship to space. In 1996, we staged an exhibition entitled Maps Elsewhere, which included a unique collaboration between Joe Stockham and Deborah Levy, as well as works by Chris Ofili, Anne Talentire, and Alistair Raphael. The exhibition was accompanied by an anthology called Simply Map, which featured the work of over 50 artists and writers. The idea for the project came from an evolving artist dialogue between the artist Joe Stockham and the writer Deborah Levy that began in 1989, when they met for the first time in Cambridge. The dialogue centred on common interests in maps and mapping and ways to reinvent maps conventionally drawn around both physical and psychological geographies. This dialogue evolved in the context of Iniva and came to fruition in physical form as a collaborative artwork between Stockham and Levy, an exhibition and a publication. I think this demonstrates one of Iniva's most important characteristics, which is increasingly rare in an art world which thrives on the idea of the celebrity artist or star curator, because Iniva offered up a space to an extraordinarily diverse range of artists and thinkers to develop their ideas and bring them to fruition, and as such, acted as a kind of ideas incubator, allowing those ideas and practices to take shape and be disseminated to a wider audience. In the summer of 1999, as part of a season called Celluloid Cities, Iniva presented a number of historical Egyptian cinema posters selected by the Lebanese designer Rana Salam on massive billboards throughout London. By representing posters that had been produced using traditional techniques over the preceding 2 decades, the iconography of Cairo, one of the world's oldest and most dynamic metropolises, collided with one of Europe's largest and most culturally diverse cities. The metropolis provided a powerful metaphor for Iniva in the late 1990s. At a time when national identities were being eroded by the growth of global capital and ethnic identities were being violently asserted within Europe's borders in places like the former Yugoslavia, the post-colonial cities of the world offered up the promise of a cosmopolitanism where cultures and ethnicities coexisted and intermingled. In the urban hubs of cities like Birmingham, Cairo, London, and Mumbai, no single group could lay claim to possess the city in its entirety. In London, a dynamic urban culture had been created by the continuous flux of migrants, from Huguenots in the 17th century to the post-war migrations from the Caribbean and Indian subcontinent, and the more recent arrivals from Eastern Europe. This continuous and changing influx means that the character of the metropolis, from Bangalore to Johannesburg to Paris, was undergoing constant transformation. This was reflected in projects like Parisienne, an exhibition curated by Ho Hanru, which was staged at Camden Arts Centre in London in 1997. All of the participating artists, Absalon, Shohreh Fejdu, Thomas Hirschhorn, Hong Yong-ping, Sarkis, Tina Kitera, Tsuneko Tanuyuchi, Shen Wan, and Shen Zhen, had lived and worked in Paris but had cultural roots outside France. During my tenure as director, race and nation were never organising curatorial principles, which is to say that we never organised exhibitions of Cuban or African art. However, questions of race and nation were continuously addressed at Iniva's programme. To take the question of nation first, one cannot deal with the international in artistic or intellectual terms without also dealing with the idea of the national and without dealing with the idea of the nation and national identity. So while Parisian does not specifically address the question of Frenchness or French national identity, the artists and the works presented interrogated Paris's identity as a modern artistic city and asserted the influence of both colonial history and migration on the formation of Parisian and, by extension, of French culture. Probably one of Iniva's best-known commissions is Yinka Shonibari's Diary of a Victorian Dandy, a series of images shot in the English stately home, portraying a fictional Victorian dandy at different times of the day. Diary of a Victorian Dandy taps into the iconography of films and television programmes which present a nostalgic and mythical image of an English past. The project was initially presented as a single image poster on the London Underground. We were unable to secure a venue to host the exhibition initially, and because Shonibari's images could be read as stills used for film posters, we felt this solution stayed true to the spirit of the work, while also extending Iniva's programme beyond traditional gallery walls to new audiences. The work was seen by over 3 million people on a number of sites across London Underground. Of course, Shonibari's Dandy is more than a playful restaging of an English imaginary. It's also a powerful critique of the absence of British colonialism, or rather the absence of any critical reflection on British colonialism in popular fictional restagings of Victorian era. And it is this absence which Shonibar makes visible by reinscribing himself into the historical frame of his images. The diary was presented as part of a season that explored the idea of Englishness and the limits of nationhood. Other events included Vindaloo and Chips, a debate on and dinner with some of so-called young British artists or YBAs who rose to fame in the early 1990s, as well as discussion on the Millennium Dome and national theme parks, among other things. The point I want to make here is that debates and talks were as important as exhibitions in the context of Iniva's programme, which conceived a broader concept of curation. We saw ourselves as being in the business of curating ideas, not just artworks. An exploration of the past was also part of a wider and bolder project by Iniva to rewrite the canon of Western art history, revealing the interrelationship between artists, artworks, and ideas across different cultural and geographical spaces, and by doing so, to rewrite the history of modernism. Projects like Rhapsodies in Black, curated by Richard J. Powell and David A. Bailey, took a fresh look at the Harlem Renaissance, contesting narrow interpretations of it as an isolated phenomenon, restricted to a designated, racially circumscribed area of New York, and instead recognizing it as a historical moment of global significance, with connections to Europe, Africa, the Caribbean, and other parts of the USA, in particular Chicago and the Deep South. Projects like Rhapsodies in Black and the important series of anthologies annotating arts histories, conceived and edited by the art historian and cultural critic Cobham Mercer, where Iniva was effectively challenging the established discourse of modernism and its exclusive band of protagonists, represents the points at which Iniva's artistic and intellectual project met with the most institutional resistance. Iniva asks the question, how do we define what it is to be modern? Is modernity rooted in a particular time and location, or is it a way of thinking, living, and working? As Stuart Hall wrote, the world is absolutely littered by modernities, by artists who do not regard modernism as the secure possession of the West, never regarded it as such, but always regarded it as a language which was both open to them, but which they would have to transform. Iniva also led the way with its groundbreaking publishing projects, which included seminal books such as Okwi and Wazer and Oluwelbe's Reading the Contemporary, African Art from Theory to Marketplace, and Gerardo Mosquera and Oriana Badley's Beyond the Fantastic, Contemporary Art Criticism from Latin America, both of which had a huge impact globally. Iniva recast modernity as a set of experiences that encompass the movement of peoples across the globe and the exchange of cultures across geographical borders. This went against the grain of an understanding of modernity as the preserve of a small number of artists, of nations in the Western Hemisphere, and of modernism as the artistic expression of a small cultural elite in Europe. In the 1980s and 1990s, questions of race and identity came to the fore in the work of many contemporary artists, writers and critics. As Kobinamasa writes, identity became a shorthand for talking about the politics of difference, initially seen as uniquely the preoccupation of artists and thinkers from culturally diverse backgrounds. It subsequently became clear that race and identity had come to define the way in which culture and society was understood and experienced on a global basis. Far from dispensing with the categories of race and ethnicity as defining identity within the public and private realms, the most recent phase in the process of globalization added another layer to the intricate construction and experience of individual identity. The exhibition Veil, Veiling Representation in Contemporary Art, which I co-curated with the artists Shanan Al-Ani, Zainab Sadira, and curator David A. Bailey, demonstrates the point. Conceived before 9/11, the exhibition collided with its political aftermath, attracting censorship from the local authority in Walsall and the West Midlands, who censored the inclusion of artworks by the Russian artist collective AES. Collage images of New York's iconic Statue of Liberty, veiled, in an Arab market on the bridge facing the House of Parliament in London. AES's images, which had been circulating on the internet for a number of years, were now deemed unpatriotic, at a moment when British and American troops were preparing to invade Iraq in spring 2003. The imagined geographies of the artists in AES collided with a political reconfiguration of the geography of the Middle East after 9/11. Veil was in development some years before the events of September 11th, emerging from the concerns of a number of contemporary visual artists, in particular the artists Shanan Al-Ani and Zainab Sadira, who initiated the project, who were exploring the idea of the veil in their artistic practice. After 9/11, the exhibition inevitably became entangled in the struggle between competing polemical representations of the Middle East, which the project had sought to problematize and critique. Both Al-Ani and Sadira had been engaged in research some years prior to the exhibition coming to fruition, and both sought to bring together works which went against the grain of didactic and unambiguous representations. Both Al-Ani and Sadira, according to Al-Ani, the artists in the exhibition helped to broaden the debate on representation in the veil in a complex and provocative way, and to sow doubts about the facts of the past by looking at something we think we know and understand. Sadira also deployed the veil in her practice. She did so both as visual motif in her work, but also as a reference to the less visible effects of veiling, which she described as veiling the mind. According to Sadira, I refer to veiling the mind in order to explore the multiple forms of veiling in both Western and Muslim cultures. I find myself asking how to represent the unrepresentable, and my artistic interventions reveal my desire to open up the paradoxes, ambiguities, and symbolism of the veil. It is in this desire to move away from fixed assumptions, unambiguous certainties, and the conviction that certain cultures are both knowable and representable in a literal sense, that attracted Al-Ani and Sadira to investigate questions of identity and representation through the concept of the veil. But in the aftermath of 9/11, no venue in London or New York would entertain the idea of showing the exhibition. Perhaps one could conjecture, precisely because the exhibition insisted upon multiple, ambiguous readings and interpretations. The exhibition eventually opened in 2003 at the New Art Gallery, Walsall, and AES's images ended up on the front pages of the local newspaper in full colour. The exhibition became a talking point in pubs and cafes throughout Walsall, attracting 35,000 people to come and see it. Many people saw the exhibition as being in some way prescient or prophetic of future events and debates about political Islam, religious difference, the veil and veiling, within public and political discourse. Rather than being prophetic, however, I would argue that the process of researching, making artworks, and curating the exhibition was a way of reading the world through the prism of the visual, which I think is what Iniva did best. Thank you.
Gilane will now join us via Zoom for Q&A. So if you have any brief questions, please raise your hand.
Recording in progress.
Hello, this is Tom Trevor. Hello, Gilane, nice to see you. We curated, Zoe Sherman and myself curated a project, The Visible and the Invisible, in '96 through Iniva. It was such an amazing opportunity. Actually, we spent quite a lot of time trying to make that project happen independently, and it was so amazing when Iniva supported us, when you brought that in and enabled it to happen. As you've described, it was an exciting time, and Iniva was really kind of changing things. And actually, when you took on the building, it felt like a radical shift. And for me, that was quite disappointing, actually, because I enjoyed the fact that it was a project for platforms like ours. But there was also this sense that you were bringing that internationalism into the kind of mainstream European institutions. And it is really important that we have our institutions. So it's really interesting that now, after this kind of 20 years or so of backwards regression in a way with institutions in the UK in particular, now at last you're in this very Central European institution. I wonder how you're going to bring your internationalist spirit to that as well, and bring back that excitement and change.
Thanks, Tom. I also have really fantastic memories of the project and of working with you and Zoe. It was a really special project. And as you say, that kind of fluidity and ability to respond and be permeable as an organization and work with lots and lots of different people was very important. I think in terms of the Whitechapel Gallery, the Whitechapel, interestingly enough, as I said, Iniva was first of all imagined as a Whitechapel type gallery space. And it's interesting and in fact, Iniva worked with Whitechapel, for example, on the Aubrey Williams exhibition and other things. I think for me, the question has always been, with wherever I've been, whether Iniva or now at the Whitechapel Gallery, is what does this particular conjuncture require? What moment are we in? And what is it that is missing from the context in which we are all working, whether as artists or curators or directors of institutions? And for me, the question is particularly pointed at the Whitechapel, which was an incredibly radical proposition in 1901 to build a gallery in the East End of London, a working class area full of migrants and people from different cultural backgrounds. In a sense, the world was and remains in the East End. And it was a building that was built with no steps, no grand columns like the British Museum or Tate Gallery. And I think what's interesting for me is to explore what it means for an institution like the Whitechapel Gallery to be a radical proposition in 2023 and beyond.
Ghislaine, hi, Louise Neary, and congratulations on your new position. I wanted to ask you, I can't imagine what it would have been like to spend a decade being mentored and collaborating actively with Stuart Hall, and also what it was like to lose him in your firmament. And can you name some of the figures that might be your new coordinates and your new position? I'm sorry if I'm putting you on the spot with that, but it'd be interesting to understand the then and the now.
Oh. Louise, lovely to hear your voice. I can't see any of you, so it's really weird. I can see myself, I can't see you, and I wish I was there with such wonderful friends, but really good to hear you, Louise. Very good question. I mean, Stuart came on very reluctantly as chair of Iniva and said, I'll do it temporarily, Gilane, just temporarily. And 12 years later, it was great to be able to look back on what was an extraordinary journey with Stuart. In terms of that relationship, perhaps it's important to say that Stuart had a very particular, he had so many talents and abilities, but he was incredibly generous to a younger generation, not just to me, but artists like Isaac Julian and Sonia Boyce and curators like David A. Bailey and Mark Seeley, so we felt, we didn't feel, it felt very equal as a relationship. Although, of course, he was so much more experienced and such an amazing thinker and philosopher, he was really interested in what a younger generation was doing and thinking about, because critically, he understood that the visual arts was a very particular and important form of knowledge making and understanding. And he saw that as a prism through which to understand and make sense of wider shifts and changes in society and culture. And so his engagement with Iniva and also with Autograph, the Association of Black Photographers led by Mark Seeley, was really a deep engagement, and one which informed his theoretical thinking and shifted his theoretical thinking as time went on. I'm currently working on a book which will come out next year, which is bringing together Stuart's writings on the visual arts, which are little known actually, particularly outside the visual arts sector, and his contribution to cultural studies, to Marxist thinking, to race and difference are better understood than his engagement with the visual arts. So, and the other thing to say is that family and friends set up the Stuart Hall Foundation, which I chair, and which seeks to continue Stuart's legacy by supporting a younger generation of artists, writers, activists, thinkers, scholars, who I hope will make the important interventions and shifts in the years to come. So in terms of, my inspiration, very hard to replace Stuart, as you said, Louise. I am inspired by the younger generation. I'm inspired, by people like Sipaki, who is currently director of Iniva, of individuals like Farzana Khan, who are activists working at the interface between questions of health and self-determination and representation. So I continue to be inspired by my friend and other mentor, Sarat Maharaj, who I think is one of the most important thinkers alive. There are many, many people who continue to inspire me. I don't think I'll ever have a relationship or partnership, though, like the one that I was so privileged to enjoy with Stuart.
Hello, Gilane. Thank you very much for your presentation. As a young artist in the mid-90s, I used to come to Iniva, and it was a real inspiration to see the publications that you were doing over the years, and also just the catalogs of artists that were not in other libraries. I guess the radical vision that you had inspired through the institution was happening at a time when it was quite a fraught cultural space in Britain. And I guess my question is that post-COVID, cuts to culture and art in Britain, and post-Brexit space, the cultural space that we encounter as a result of Brexit, the kind of hostile environment that has been created over the last few years. How do you see yourself navigating this with the experience that you've had over the last 20 years? Because it is a very different and yet quite, still quite challenging, if not more challenging space.
Yeah. Can you say your name, please? Because I can't see you.
Sorry, it's Naiza Khan. I'm a visual
Oh,
artist.
nice. Hi, hello. Really good question. I mean, this is a really, really difficult time. I think in many ways it's a more difficult time than the moment of establishing Iniva, which had its own challenges and difficulties, definitely. I think the word crisis is probably overused, but I feel right now that's not an overstatement. I think we are in a time of crisis, economically, politically, in relation to the climate crisis and emergency. And it's probably the worst and most difficult time to be running a cultural institution. And yet at the same time, it seems to me the most important time to be doing so, because, our role has never been more urgent or necessary. I mean, during COVID, I think a lot of people turned to the arts, not just the visual arts, but to theatre, literature, film, as a sort of respite, and also as a place for support, particularly during lockdowns, during quite dark times when we didn't know what the way out, if there was a way out, how long the way out would be from the pandemic. As you say, in the aftermath of Brexit, but not just in the UK, internationally, we've seen the rise of the far right across the world, and increasingly authoritarian administrations which are trying to reverse the gains made in terms of all kinds of agendas of difference around sexuality, around gender, around race, around social justice more generally. And I think that this is why we need cultural institutions, we need to step up. We need to take a position. We need to be brave, which is hard because resources and funding is very stretched, very thin on the ground. We're all facing financial crises, the like of which we haven't experienced for many, many decades. But I think this moment requires us to to speak to some of those urgencies and rethink in a very profound way what it means to be a cultural institution at this particular moment.
Thank you, Gilane. We have to end the session here. Thank you for joining us via Zoom, and thank you to our audience.